Today on Commander Replay, find out what happens when I feel like Aurelia the War Leader isn't aggressive enough. We build the most aggressive deck the world has ever seen. A deck filled with only threats, no answers. This is 45 Creature Aurelia. Hello everyone, welcome back. Got a deck that I'm very excited to show you guys. This is Aurelia, all threats, sporting an incredible 45 creatures. So I want to tell you the story of how I came up with this deck, and then we'll take a look at some of the cards that are in it. So last week I was playing at the shop, I was in a 4-player game, and I was facing an Azami opponent, and I know that the opponent's deck is very strong. It's a combo deck, has a few different combos for winning. One involves Palinchron, some of the other ones involve Laboratory Maniac. Fairly standard high power blue combo deck. So I was playing my best Aurelia deck, which I believe is my equipment build that uses Sunforger and a bunch of other stuff. What happened was, so the key play of the game was, I had a Sunforger equipped to an Archangel of Thune, and I tapped out all of my red mana to cast an Insurrection because I thought it was going to end the game. Unfortunately, the Azami player was able to overload a Cyclonic Rift, and for sure, I should have seen that play coming, but I didn't because earlier in the game, the Azami opponent was forced to discard their entire hand. They found the next draw spell in there somewhere, so they did end up drawing a few cards again. But after already discarding their hand and not being able to do much for a while, I wasn't expecting that they would have Cyclonic Rift. They did, and eventually I went on to lose that game. And I probably should have won it because I was doing some serious work with Sunforger, and if I had just not tapped out for the Insurrection, I'd probably win the game, because if he Cyclonic Rifts, I go and get Teferi's Protection, and then all my stuff's fine, and I can attack with it again next turn, and no big deal. So yeah, I went from probably winning the game to I definitely lost the game, and a lot of it had to do with that play right there. Anyway, I started thinking to myself, beside the misplay, what else should this deck be doing to combat really difficult combo opponents? The main reason that I started playing Aurelia was because I wanted something aggressive. The problem is that Aurelia is 6 mana, so because she's pretty expensive to cast, she's aggressive when she's on board, but she's not aggressive in terms of coming into play very quickly and killing opponents before they have a chance to do very much. So the main thought I had was, how can I be more aggressive? And as I started thinking about what it meant to be aggressive, I started to realize that that deck is running a very low 17 creatures, and it hasn't been feeling very aggressive lately, and I realized that it's been slowly morphing into a red-white control deck, and I realized that most of the games that I win of late have to do with having Sunforger in play and just using Sunforger to basically stop anything our opponents are doing and protect all of our stuff. So I realized that the way that deck was set up, it just wasn't being very aggressive. And the whole reason that I started playing aggressive decks is because I like to put that pressure on the opponents, especially ones whose win condition is going to be something other than creature combat damage, which is typically hard to interact with. So anyway, after going through this whole debate with Sunforger, and believe me, I love Sunforger, it's an amazing card, but the problem with Sunforger is that once you add Sunforger, now you're taking up like 5 to 8 slots of your deck with cards that are very reactive. I thought to myself, what's on the other side of the coin? The other side of the coin is being proactive, and I need to add more creatures. So while I was sitting at work the next day, still thinking about this game from the night before, I'm like, how can I ensure that I'm more aggressive? So I just started messing around on a spreadsheet at work. I'm like, what if I make my deck all creatures? Every single card in the deck needs to be a threat. So I wrote down a bunch of stuff on the spreadsheet. What if I could get all of the abilities from those spells from creatures? That way you have a body that can attack and do damage, but you're still getting the effects you need like mana ramp and removal, in addition to having a creature that can now attack, so you're also being aggressive. So it was basically this idea of, I want all creatures, and I want the creatures to replace non-creature cards, but giving us the same effect that the non-creature cards would have gave us. And by the way, I'm in a Discord chat with MTG Mudsta, Jolt539, and Eli Pie from Magic Stronghold, and I started thinking about this thing, and basically I've been driving them crazy with it all week. I'm like, wait, I think this thing's actually gonna work. And they're like, man, how much Boros do you play? I'm like, well, you know, it's kind of my thing. Anyway, so I've been driving them crazy with this deck list, and I'm very excited to show it to you guys. So I got home, played a couple games with this thing, and actually ended up winning the first 3 games that I played with it, which just had my mind blown. Where I ended up with this deck, we have 45 creatures, 38 lands, and 16 non-creature cards that almost all of which are very threatening or are such powerful effects that they can't be replaced by a creature. So, as much as I wanted to make this deck 62 creatures, taking out things like Sol Ring and Mana Crypt is pretty impractical, just because there's nothing in the game that can replace those. So, I felt comfortable going with a 45 creature list. The only non-creatures in this deck are basically irreplaceable effects at their mana cost. Most of those cards live in the 1 converted mana cost slot, so it's going to be your Sol Ring, Tithe just to make sure we hit lands, Land Tax just to make sure we hit lands, and Light and Tutor. Mana, as we already talked about, Mana Crypt, Sol Ring. Then basically the only other non-creatures in this deck are some Mana Ramp and Thran Dynamo because our curve is kind of high, and a handful of the best equipment for this deck. Moving on, so we have a bunch of creatures, Selfless Spirit to give us indestructible protection for our creatures, Stoneforge Mystic because it's a tutor on a creature, Knight of the White Orchid, this is some of our Mana Ramp, as well as Gold Mirror and Iron Mirror and Plague Mirror, so we're getting a bunch of Mana Ramp that's now also our creatures, which, once I stumbled onto the Mirror, I'm like, you know what? There's going to be enough Mana Ramp in creatures that I think it can support this deck. And that's when I actually started to get really excited about it and wanted to leave work and go home and test this thing out. Equipment-wise, we have Sword of the Animus and Umezawa's Jitte in the 2 slots. Sword of the Animus, obviously just make sure that we hit all our lands and can play all our spells. Umezawa's Jitte, just an unbelievably powerful card. So moving on to the 3 slot, we have a bunch of creatures that are really typical to Aurelia decks. Bastion Protector, Eldrazi Displacer, Combat Celebrant, Silverblade Paladin. Fervor is one of the few non-creatures in this deck. Because we're playing so many creatures, it really makes sense for us to have haste. Made the decision to include Fervor. Magus of the Wheel because it's card draw on a creature. Viashino Heretic because it's artifact removal on a creature. Wheel of Fortune, another irreplaceable card. There's just nothing else that replaces that in terms of power and efficiency. Palladium Mirror, which is basically like Worn Power Stone, and in some respects almost even a little bit better because of Aurelia's untap ability. Just that Worn Power Stone obviously doesn't get blown up by a Day of Judgment, so that's a thing. And then at the bottom of the 3 slot, we have Sword of Feast and Famine, Sword of Fire and Ice, and Sword of Light and Shadow. When you're running this many creatures, having Sword of Light and Shadow really makes a lot of sense, so I was happy that I got to include that one. In the 4 slot, we have Odric Lunarch Marshal, which spreads our creature abilities across all of our creatures each combat, so seems really good if you're playing a ton of creatures. Selfless Squire, because this is a fog on a creature. Hero of Bladehole, just an amazing threat in an Aurelia deck, just unbelievable. Treasonous Ogre, this is a card I've started messing around with a little bit, but this is also Mana Ramp, just that it comes at a very steep cost of life. But we are running some expensive things in this deck, so a lot of times it is going to be worth it for us to pay some life to get some extra mana. Ogre Battle Driver, because this is another source of haste, also pumps our creatures up a little bit. Firemane Avenger, this will be one of our main sources of removal. At any point before a board wipe is cast, we should have Battalion pretty easily. After a board wipe it might get tricky, who knows. We should be able to achieve Battalion very easily, and if you have Firemane Avenger with Aurelia down, you're getting 2 triggers of 3 damage each, so you can definitely do some work on the board with that. Iroas to make sure that it's always profitable for our creatures to attack. Tajik gets really cool when you have Battalion because he gets really big on the second combat step. First he becomes a 7/7, the second time he becomes a 12/12, so that's just a lot of fun. He also wears equipments really well because he's indestructible, so it's just really hard for opponents to interact with him. So in the 5 slot, we have some pretty standard but very powerful things that I think we would want to see. We have Revel Arc to be able to get some of our creatures back in case they die. That's some recursion for us that happens to exist on a body. We have Archangel Athune just because it's really, really good. Bishop of Rebirth, more recursion, because if we're playing 45 creatures and someone casts a board wipe, we're gonna want a way to get some of our creatures back. Stonehewer Giant wins games all by itself in equipment decks, so must include. Sunscorched Region, just really powerful on its own, really powerful in Aurelia, definitely wanted to include that. And Glorybringer is something I started messing around with. Glorybringer is really powerful with Aurelia. Like Firemane Avenger, being able to attack and just start doling out damage to creatures is a really big deal. Especially how early in the game Glorybringer can do it. At turn 5, there aren't usually things that are bigger than 4 toughness. Occasionally there are. But it's fairly uncommon that by turn 5, something absolutely massive is on the table that can't be removed by 4 damage. Also, if your playgroup runs a lot of the Commander 2016 commanders, 4 damage kills just about all of them. And when I say just about all of them, I also mean all the secondary commanders with partner as well. We have Sun Titan, just a staple of white decks. True Conviction, because, yeah, having this many creatures, you want them to have double strike and lifelink. No way around it. Victory's Herald gives flying and lifelink to all of our creatures. Mostly it's in there for the flying ability, giving all of our small guys evasion. Will really help to make our attacks profitable and make sure the damage gets through. Hammerfist Giant, this is also removal on a stick for us. It does have the unfortunate side effect that we are playing a lot of small creatures that will get swept up by the Hammerfist Giant, but there may be a time, if there's like a million tokens on board or something like that, that we do need to activate the Giant, prevent ourselves from dying. Now, if we have Iroas in play or a Selfless Spirit, we can use either of their abilities to prevent all the damage to our creatures and fire off the Hammerfist Giant during combat, so that way everyone else's creatures take damage and ours don't. So that's a thing that can definitely happen. Finally, in the 6th slot, we have Inferno Titan, very good in an Aurelia deck. Also another source of removal for us. We have at least 4 really solid creatures that act as removal. And again, they're creatures, so they're also threats, which I really like. That was what I was going for in this deck. Finally, in the 7th slot, we have some really interesting things. We have Angel of Glory's Rise, because we're running a decent number of humans. If our stuff starts dying, we're gonna want a way to get it back. It's a little pricey at 7 mana, and I've thought about maybe just running Karmic Guide in its place, but I still gotta test it out a little bit. We'll see how it goes. At first I had Crescendo of War in this deck, which is a really fun card and something you guys should check out, but in trying to achieve the all-creature theme, I replaced that with Elish Norn, which just seems like a really good idea in a really creature-heavy deck like this. It both pumps up our creatures, makes our opponent's creatures smaller, and is removal for opponent's creatures that have 2 toughness or less. Just an extremely powerful magic card. Angel of Serenity, this is both the source of removal and recursion, which again, are abilities that we want, but we wanted to achieve from our creatures. Most of our other creature-based removal is damage-based, which means things with indestructible are a problem. Occasionally, you do just need to exile something. So that's why Angel of Serenity's in there, and also has the ability to get stuff back from our graveyard if we need to. Dragon Mage, haven't seen this one in play yet. I assume it'll be decent, but just another source of card draw in the deck that's on a creature, so definitely wanted to include that. Nullspine Dragon, same sort of thing, card draw on a creature. And then finally, Gisela Blade of Gold Knight, because when you have Gisela and Aurelia in play, you're about 90% to win the game. Anyway, this is the Aurelia All Threats deck, featuring 45 creatures. I am very excited to show off the gameplay in this deck, so let's go find a match.